This lesson is about climate change. Climate change is one of the biggest things that will have an impact on our near-term future, and by near-term, I'm talking about the next say 20 to 50 years. So I think this is going to have a big impact, and so we'll talk a little bit more about it in this lesson. Here's a little graph. This is from the IPCC report in 2014, I believe, and it gives the sectors in which greenhouse gas emissions are being emitted. And so you can see, 25% for electricity and heat production, about 24% for agriculture and other land use, 6% buildings, 14% transportation, 21% industry, and 10% other energy. So let's talk just a couple minutes about each of these little areas. So electricity and heat production accounts for 25% of greenhouse gases. In terms of electricity, a lot of electricity is generated still by burning coal or by burning natural gas. So here in BC, we're lucky enough that most of our electricity is actually produced by hydropower, which does not produce any greenhouse gases. But I believe we do still have some natural gas plants. And elsewhere in the world that are not as lucky as us to have so many rivers that we can dam to make electricity. Many of those, the primary means of producing electricity is by burning natural gas or coal. Heat production. So I'm not sure if heat production is referring to heating our buildings, but I do know, or if that part falls into the 6% buildings, but I do know that heating our buildings is a big and significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. For most of us, for most of us here in Vancouver, our homes are for the most part heated with gas furnaces, which are burning fossil fuels, natural gas. There are some older homes that have still an oil furnace. Oil, of course, is also a fossil fuel. And finally, there are homes that are heated with radiant heating. And so what happens is water is heated up, and then the water heats up the home. But the water usually is heated with natural gas. And so that is, ultimately also using natural gas. So a majority of homes and buildings in BC are heated by fossil fuels, and so that's something that the government is trying to change. There's the newer technology of heat pumps, which uses electricity, similar to an air conditioning unit, except it works in reverse. So instead of cooling the inside and heating the outside, then the heat pumps will heat the inside and cool the outside. And then in the summer, then they can also work in reverse. And so they work basically as an air conditioner in the summertime. So I actually recently got a heat pump installed in my own home. So I don't rely on fossil fuels to heat my home anymore. And actually the cost of it, I thought it would be more, but it's actually about the same in terms of how much it costs to heat my home. Let's talk about the orange part, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Presumably they're talking about all of the emissions that are given off in our production of food. And so everybody is familiar, of course, with the cow burps and cow burping out methane, and that is a contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. But there are other things as well. The production of fertilizer on a large scale produces emissions as well. And just the use of the land, I think, if you do agriculture in certain ways, the ground will actually store up carbon and become a carbon sink. But if you do agriculture in the way that kind of we customarily do it here in the world, then the ground is actually giving off more carbon than it absorbs. So it becomes not a carbon sink, but the opposite. It's giving off carbon. And so that's where some of that comes from. That can be solved as well. It's just a matter of changing the farming practices. And those practices, my understanding is that they are pretty well established, and we could, in fact, change our agriculture and land practices instead of giving off carbon dioxide to absorb carbon. That would mean, however, a couple of things. It would mean, number one, we would eat less, we would be less reliant on beef and other kind of big animals for our food, and so we would have to eat less meat, basically. And we would also, the farming practices would also have to change in a way that would make our food, a little bit more expensive. But the technology is already there. Another area in which technology is pretty much there and getting more there every time is transportation. Everyone is, of course, familiar with electric cars, and we see, I would say in the last 5 years, the number of electric cars on the road is just gone straight up through the roof. And hopefully that trend will continue. And in fact, by 2035, 13 years from now, in BC, we will not, car dealerships will no longer be allowed to sell new fossil fuel vehicles. So that's on a good trend. Other modes of transportation show a little bit less promise. There's not really any realistic solutions right now for air travel, ocean travel. Also cost a lot of fossil fuels. So those are two areas in which people are still working on, but some people are like reducing the amount of air travel that they do to kind of reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of a personal choice that you could make. Industry, 21%. And so this is talking about large, big scale industry. And I think in particular things like production of concrete and cement, and also production of like metal and smelting mines, stuff like that. And in those sectors, I believe there are also, the technology is not quite there yet to replace, for example, cement. There are different things, different ideas that people have in terms of like concrete and cement replacements, but none of them are kind of commercially viable yet. And there's potentially, things that people can do in terms of smelting metal and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that relies on hydrogen as a fuel source rather than fossil fuels. Those are areas in which we don't have great solutions yet, but research is kind of underway. Okay, so that kind of gives us a little bit of overview about where the greenhouse gases are coming from in our world, and let's go into what some of the effects are going to be. So 1 to 2 degrees of warming. This is pretty much, I believe, at this moment. So as I record this in 2023, we're already at between 0.5 to 1 degree of warming. And so what we see from 1 to 2 degrees of warming is pretty much something quite similar to what we're seeing now, but worse. So we already see extreme weather, and we talk about here in BC, we have seen heat waves. What do they call it? Heat domes, right? We have seen big storms, atmospheric rivers. We have seen droughts in some part of the province, big floods. All of those kind of extreme weather, and we always hear, this is a once-in-a-century storm. Well, if a once-in-a-century storm happens like every 5 years or something, it's not once in a century anymore, right? So these kind of extreme weather events are happening more and more frequently, and we can expect that to continue and get worse, I would say. We could potentially see some minor sea level rise. So probably won't be a huge amount, but there are like some cities which are right on the water and which may not have the resources to like build up walls and dikes, and so they may be affected by kind of the sea level rise. Food production decreases. So, as the warming gets, as the temperatures get warmer and the weather gets more extreme, especially in those places closer to the equator, the hotter places, this will mean that less food will be able to produce because the plants will just be under more stress. When you have like say 50 degrees Celsius weather for a few days, like plants may not be able to survive that, and so they might just die out. And so we might see food production decrease. As a result of food production decreasing, we'll probably see like food prices increase. And we already have seen some food production or some food prices increase more for kind of economic reasons at the moment, but we may be seeing those type of increases for like climate reasons as well. As I mentioned, the warming will tend to affect the global south more because it is hotter there. And so for us, average summertime temperature 25, and if it goes up to 30, like not a big deal. But for those people on the world, if their average summertime temperatures are like, say 35 or 40 degrees, and now it's going to be, 45 degrees, those are temperatures where it's like literally dangerous to like be outdoors, which a lot of people do have to be outdoors all the time. In addition, in the global south, those tend to be poorer countries, and so fewer people are able to afford, say, like central air conditioning the way that we can here in Canada. Another effect that we'll see is that plants and animals start to have to migrate to other areas, or they may just die out. And so we're already seeing many of these kind of effects with biodiversity decreasing, and you all know probably coral reefs are dying out, things like that. So we're already seeing these effects. We'll see more of them. So that was the best case scenario. What about the second or most likely scenario, I would say? Most likely scenario is 2 to 3 degrees. I believe the projections are now, assuming that governments will kind of follow through on the promises that they have made. The projection is somewhere 2 to 2.5 degrees of warming. So this is the most likely scenario that we see. And all of the problems that we see in the 1 to 2 degree scenario are also obviously true. But there are more problems that come with more warming, and so problems with food production become so drastic that social risk increases. Like there may be famine or kind of starvation in many countries, which will kind of increase the risk that people are unhappy or desperate and turn to like desperate measures, whether that's like rebelling against their own government or going to war with other countries or something like that. Those kind of things may increase. Some cities might become flooded. And so I mentioned that already with 1 to 2 degrees, we might see some rise in sea level, and 2 to 3 degrees, we will definitely see some rise in sea level, and probably not, like rich countries will still be able to build those walls to keep the water out, but poorer countries will not, and so people will have to migrate. Some cities or countries may have insufficient water to meet their daily needs. So drought becomes a problem. So ironically, at the same time that there's too much water, there's also drought at the same time. And so we're already seeing drought in certain countries. South Africa comes to mind as a country where like the entire country had to go on water rations for some time. And there's different parts of certain countries. And for example, California comes to mind as one where there had been in a drought for kind of off and on for many, many years now. The other extreme, they had like just recently a whole bunch of atmospheric river storms. And so it goes kind of from one extreme to the other. Internal and external migration, as certain areas in countries become unlivable potentially, or at least if not unlivable, then it's very hard for people to farm there or do something on the land. Then they'll have to move to other places, and potentially they'll want to move to other countries where things are better off. So that's where you see the external migration, moving from one country to another. And so we might see like many millions, like hundreds of millions of people start to migrate between countries, and we would call those like climate refugees or climate migrants. And so if you have millions of kind of refugees on your doorstep, what will you do? Armed conflict, as I said, as people become more desperate, armed conflict becomes more likely. We have been relatively lucky in our lifetime not to have seen a lot of armed conflict, especially here in North America. We're lucky in that way. And might we see like armed conflict elsewhere in the world or even here? Here is probably unlikely, but not impossible. And then we have the possibility of more than 3 degrees of warming. And so here's where we start to get into the area of feedback loops. And so feedback loops are the possibility that the warmer it gets, it creates conditions to make the warming even faster. And so here's a few examples. So permafrost melt. So up in the Arctic, up in like Northwest Territories and Yukon, there's a layer under the ground that is always frozen. And in that layer of kind of frozen ground is a lot of methane. Well, if that permafrost melts, then all that methane will be released. And with all the methane in the world, that will make global warming even faster. Another potential feedback loop is ice albedo, which means that when we have our polar ice caps are obviously white because they are ice, and because they are white, as we know, white reflects the sunlight, right? And so a lot of the sunlight that's hitting the Earth is actually get reflected off by those ice caps. Well, if those ice caps will melt, then instead of the sunlight being reflected off, they will be absorbed into the ocean. And so that's another way that if we get warm enough to melt the ice caps, then the warming is going to increase much more because we'll be absorbing that much more sunlight. Forest fire is something similar, where the more hotter it is, the more forest fires we have. And the more forest fires we have, right? Forest fires, of course, burn down the trees, and burning the trees releases carbon dioxide. And so, the more forests burn down, the more carbon dioxide will be in the atmosphere. So there's another one where, if we get past kind of a tipping point of climate change, of warming, then it can get drastically worse. And so there are a bunch of feedback loops. Those are just 3 examples. There's other ones that are out there that if we get too warm, we run the risk of going over the tipping point of some of these feedback loops. And, as an end result, then climate change could get, quite bad, and that places become unlivable, for example. Let's talk about doubt. So some people out there might think that climate change is not real. There is, in fact, widespread scientific and political consensus that it is real, that it is warming. And, people can point to extreme weather and hotter temperatures, like very clearly it is happening. So I don't think there's probably that much doubt about the science of it anymore. But there is a lot of doubt of, do we really need to worry about it? Because, things will be fine. Money will fix some things. And that is kind of true. If you have a lot of money, it will allow you to overcome certain problems. For example, if you have a lot of money, starvation is not going to be a problem. There will be some kind of food produced somewhere, and if you have enough money, you can just spend more of your money to buy it, right? If it gets too hot outside, no problem. I'll just install an air conditioner in my house, and I'll just stay inside. So money can fix those things. However, in my opinion, it's kind of like, will you rather spend $10 now and have a nicer world later, or have like kind of an awful world later, which you can spend, say $100 to kind of build yourself a shelter? I'd rather spend the $10 now and have a nicer world. That's just how I would think about it. Other kind of arguments for doing something, compassion. I mean, some people care about someone other than themselves, and of course it is going to be the poorer people of the world who get affected the most by climate change, because they won't be able, for 2 reasons, I guess. Number 1, they live in the areas that are going to be like super hot. And number 2, they will have less ability to do something about that because they'll have less money. And finally, I think there is some non-zero chance that there is like a total catastrophe and that climate change goes totally off the rails. Is it likely? No, probably not going to happen, actually. So it's probably not going to happen, but I guess the consequences that if it does happen are so drastic that why not pay the $10 now and fix it, to have like a less chance of it happening, really. If there's even like, say, I don't know, a 2% chance that the world like has a very drastic catastrophe in terms of climate, 2% chance is really small, not a big deal, but we have the tools to fix it right now. Why not just fix it? Anyways, that's my take on it. Let's talk about Vancouver specifically. So here in Vancouver, I think we're somewhat lucky. We won't see the worst of it. As I mentioned, we already have seen, heat domes, floods, atmospheric rivers, all those kind of extreme weathers. Those will probably get worse and worse. But yeah, not too bad. We're well off here in Vancouver. I think we will see a lot of migrants to Canada from other countries because Canada is going to be one of the better places to live in the age of climate change, I think. Food, so we already talked about food, but for us, a lot of our food comes from places like California, Mexico, Florida. So all of those are places with kind of high risk of extreme heat and drought. And so they may produce less food in the future, which means our food is going to either get more expensive or the selection is going to be less than before. We also have, obviously we're right on the ocean here in Vancouver, and we have some specifically low-lying areas, for example, Richmond and False Creek. So some of those areas are basically right at sea level. And so if the sea level rises, then they could potentially be flooded. We are rich enough here in BC that we'll just build big walls and keep the water out. So I don't think it's going to be a huge issue, but I'm not a scientist, so what do I know? Armed conflict, I said possible. I mean, again, it's probably a small chance, but what if Mexico turns into an unlivable place? And so all the Mexican people push up into the United States, and the bottom 2/3 of the United States turns into an unlivable place. And so all the people from the US are crammed into Washington State and Oregon and places like that. Well, they're going to look at this humongous country just north of them and say, I wonder if we can get a piece of that action. Are we going to see armed conflict? I would say unlikely, but not impossible. We'll see. It seems hard to imagine now, but 50 years from now, when things get potentially desperate, I don't know. It's not all doom and gloom, though. There is good news. So we'll end off with some good news, I think. Number one good news, humans are really good at inventing stuff. And so solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, regenerative agriculture, lab-grown meat, geothermal energy, battery technology, heat pumps, passive house. So, I mean, there's tons and tons of great ideas. People are coming up with great ideas all the time of how we could improve and kind of start to mitigate the effects of the climate change. And so all we have to do is use some of these technologies that are already there. The technology is already there for the most part. We could decide tomorrow, hey, let's use this technology so that we don't have to worry about climate change. And it would be done. We're just not making the decision as a society to do that. And that's another piece of good news, is that younger generations, people of your age and younger, even people of my age, I'm in my 40s, but most people I know, my peers, believe that climate change is one of the major problems facing us in the world today, and we want to do something about it. It's really people who are, I won't say who is holding us back, but I think there are certain people holding us back. And as younger people get into positions of power and younger people have more of an influence in the world, things are starting to change. Things are already starting to change, to be honest. Like, I'm far more optimistic about climate change today than I was, say, 2 or 3 years ago, for sure. 2 or 3 years ago, I was super pessimistic. I didn't see a possibility that things would be better. But today, I can look at things that are happening now and look at what the commentators and what the thinkers out there are thinking and are expecting to happen, and it looks promising, I think. And so, we'll see what happens 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We'll see what the results will be. It could go bad, but I think there's a real good chance that things will actually be okay. Like, by okay, I mean not catastrophic. All right, so that's it about climate change. Good news, bad news, hopefully more good. That's it for this lesson, and see you in the next one.